Welcome to another episode of Four Guys Talking About AI. I'm here with my good buddies, Greg Sterling and John Gerard. Neil Polachek not available today, but we'll get started here. How's it going, guys?
Good. TGIF.
Nice to see you.
Good to see you as well. We got some interesting things we're going to talk about today. We're going to look at how AI is breaking out of the chat box and reshaping the way that we work, search, and interact online. We'll start out with Claude and Claude and Chat GPT and how they're turning weekly recaps and other dynamic visuals into personal news feeds, how they're integrating other apps like your calendar, your email, your Dropbox, any other kinds of apps like that. They're pulling them into their platforms, Claude and Chat GPT, so that they become this hub of all of your tools that you use to create automations doing that. So we'll jump into that. This is all about the Agentic Web. And on that note, with the Agentic Web, we're going to dig into what happens when your website starts serving machines instead of people. So there's a couple of articles this week talking about how this is the next phase of when you have agents, how those agents interact with your website. So we'll get into that. And then finally, Samsung is gearing up for a major deal with Perplexity that could change the way AI lives inside your devices. So let's get into it. Let's talk a little bit about Claude and Chat GPT and what they're doing with these hubs. John, you want to lead off with this one?
Yeah, I'm happy to. So most of us at this point have had experiences with these chatbots with Claude or more likely with Chat GPT. And it's been a pretty extraordinary ride so far, of course, and those experiences up until now have primarily been limited to interactions in the text box. So it's a text chat. There's a back and forth, and look, it's an amazing experience because it's fairly evident that there's some kind of an intelligence on the other side, even though this is all run by a machine. One of the newest things to happen, which was, I think, predicted and some other entrants in the space probably have helped to accelerate, is this kind of explosion outside the chat box or chat window. What does that mean? Well, on the front end, in terms of the input, rather than just typing in information and chatting that way, these LLMs are now connecting or allowing you to connect to other systems of record. So, for instance, your email or your calendar or your to-dos or your GitHub repository if you're a developer, and use those as a form of input into the model. So that's interesting because, frankly, most of the information that's associated with my daily work is not exposed to ChatGPT or to Claude otherwise. It's in all these other systems. And now these LLMs actually have a window into that they didn't before. The second thing that's happening is on the output side. So just in the same way that, I'm no longer only inputting via text chat, I'm also no longer only receiving the output or the final answers in text chat. And what's happening there is fun and whimsical and a little bit silly right now, but probably will grow into something quite compelling and interesting. And I'll actually share an example of this that combines both of these things. The fun and whimsical thing that's happening is, in this case with Claude, the system was able to create a visualization for me of what I did this week. And it did that visualization in the form of an HTML newsletter. So, fun, a little bit silly, not sure how practical or useful it is, but it is really interesting to me. And here's what that newspaper looks like. So it's the Gerard Gazette. It's Friday, June 6, 2025, personal edition, all the news that's fit to organize your life. That's a clever twist on New York Times tagline, I think. And this is just kind of delightful, which is I helped my uncle to set up a Wi-Fi network at a lake cabin. And I am the tech support hero that saved the lake house weekend in a dramatic turn of events unfolded throughout the morning. Local tech expert John Gerard successfully guided, et cetera, et cetera. So it's certainly, got the funny bone on me on this one. And like I said, is this game changing, going to totally change the way that I work? No, but this is an example of Claude pulling from my week, looking at my calendar, at my emails, and at my Google Drive. So taking non-text input from all of these systems of record that I use, pushing them into a fun and interesting format. And I think this is just a glimpse into what's coming next in the ChatGPT and Claude and LLM world.
Real quickly, John, what was the prompt that you used to create this?
So it was actually a canned prompt. So what they've done here is when you're using Sonnet 4, they give you a bunch of canned prompts that you can use here that will pull from your repository. So one of them happened to be create a newspaper about everything that I've done this week. And I think that one of the reasons that this is the way it is because the prompt that gets created here is pretty specific, right? So it actually says stuff in it, for instance, like if using an artifact, consider what kind to use. So it's got some very specific instructions to itself about how to make this work. And of course, here it is kind of taking this and going through everything. We're doing this experiment in real time, so I have no idea what it's gonna
what'll show up on the other end. Might want to shut that down right now.
Yeah, exactly. And stop sharing.
I do have an interesting thought around this is that, and what's really cool about Claude here is that you can see it's creating the code in real time, which I just find that to be so cool.
It's super cool. I did a version of this week. Yeah, it's very cool.
It's really cool how it programs and just does the scripting there. But what the broader context of this and connecting your apps like Dropbox or your email or your calendar and so forth is that these large language models, Claude and ChatGPT in this case, become a hub for data that it now can access. Like you said, John, it's a window into those apps. So when you now query it, it can use that as first-party data. It can use that as information that it may want to draw upon to be able to come up with suggestions or contextually relevant, kind of responses that you may be looking for. Or you very well might want to create an agent that then looks through your email and says, pick out the important stuff for me. And, and just like filters through all the garbage that we all get in our emails. And that can be super useful. There's a lot of really useful functionality here where, if you have meetings that are set on your calendar for next week, you can ask it, write me a summary of who I'm meeting with next week and go to their LinkedIn and create a summary of who that person is. If you're a salesperson, for example, that kind of capability can be really useful in terms of, giving you a window into what's coming up on your calendar and B, also how to follow up efficiently with, with people that you've met with before. And this is just right here. This is just such a cool visual of, like what's going on in your calendar and maybe even trends that you didn't even realize that may be happening. Or, this is the sixth time I've met with that person. It's time to close the deal or whatever it might be.
Yeah, right.
Well, and I'm still sharing my screen here. You can see here what it came up with. This is a sort of personalized view based on my calendar that just to your point is pulling this information from other places, giving me interesting insights. This is literally the first time I've seen this, so I can't tell you how useful it is or isn't. But
is it well, okay, so you've not seen this before. I was going to ask, is it clickable? Can you execute?
Yeah, I think so.
Take action on the basis
I think it made this. So like, I think I have done an Enneagram thing a long time ago. I don't remember what it was, but let's just say that I'm the peacemaker. So this now gives peacemaker calendar optimization, peacemaker specific calendar optimization ideas, which is pretty wild, to be honest. Like this. So this was based on that single prompt. And, this is like almost a full-fledged website, that's customized around me. And you can easily imagine sort of saying, oh, this is great. Let's take the code for this and create an actual business out of it and have it then within a few hours that was ready for public consumption.
one of the things that they showed off at Google I/O, their developer conference, was the creation of these sort of web apps on the fly to illustrate certain kinds of data presentations. And so, it's interesting to me that all of these LLM sites are going to get more visual, as appropriate to the content, as opposed to just the text, as you were saying. I think that's a really interesting development. The MCP stuff and the connectors and sort of tapping into all these different data sources, as you were discussing, Andy, just really reinforces that this has got, two things. Like, the utility that this is bringing to everything is just enormous, which will reinforce usage. What I can do with Google just pales in comparison to what I can do with ChatGPT or with Claude now. And so search becomes just a piece of a much larger, more useful suite of capabilities, as opposed to, this kind of alpha and omega destination to get information. It also abstracts everything up a layer, right? So if your primary interaction with information now and the internet as a whole, private drives and databases and the internet also is through this interface, this becomes kind of the universal tool that you use to get and execute and access all kinds of things. And you're suddenly getting everything from this sort of control center, and you're not going out to do things quite as much, which is what these other stories are talking about. I don't know if we're into that yet, or if that's a little premature, but.
Well, I think on our way into that, I might just add one last thing, which is, so we've talked about all the systems of record you might connect to. There's one final, call it system of record that some of these apps are playing with. And it's actually observing what it is that I'm doing on the screen on a day-to-day basis. So they're actually getting screen recording permissions and paying attention to everything that I look at throughout the day and then cataloging that. I've been testing an app called Little Bird. This is a little view of it. And this is sort of giving me a summary of what I've done every single day based on what I've looked at, what it's seen on the screen as I've been going through everything. And then, from that, I'm actually able to, ask it questions about various things that I did, during the day. So, like this TAS credit, this is a very specific thing that I'm working on. And it actually has insight into that because it was watching me do my email earlier. So this is now one level further than just, for instance, web history or connecting up all my other systems of record. This is sort of seeing everything that I'm doing and giving me, some insights based on that.
Wow. I can close my tabs because now I don't have to keep them open. So I remember them later. I can just query this and go, what was that thing that I was checking out earlier?
Yeah, exactly. Well, Microsoft, I forget the product name, Microsoft was going to do this, and it got a lot of pushback because people felt like, it's surveillance, right? So
good example of, you can't do it as a big company. You have to be a startup that gets a lot of, room to explore these things.
Well, as we kind of pull on the string here, there's really what we're talking about is a major shift in how the web works and who the web is for going forward. Shelley Palmer wrote an article about the Agentic Web and shows us a future where the website becomes workflows for AI agents, not humans, right? So, and then Jonah Alderson wrote an article saying, what happens when your buyer is a bot? Right. So these kinds of things are not in the future. This isn't just like sci-fi here. This is coming up. And the question is, how do you get ready for this kind of thing? When your customer, when somebody's coming to your website is an agent that somebody said, find me an XYZ, and you happen to be the part of the solution to that XYZ. How do you prepare for that? What does this future look like?
One simple answer to that question is, this is a version of SEO. People have been doing optimizations for Google. Now they're going to do optimizations for ChatGPT and Claude and Perplexity and so on and so forth. And it's not going to be identical, but there'll be similar things: structured data, clear answers to questions that your customers might ask. There's going to be a bunch of best practices that emerge. And so you'll have, people have complained about, I have to create one. Is my website for people or is it for Google? And there's been that sort of dual track mentality. And I think this just is even more of an intense version of that, because at some point people might not visit your site at all, or the number of people or the type of people who are visiting your site is pretty limited, and you're really just, your major audiences are these agents that are coming and fetching information.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's, one of the funny kind of results of that reality is that we don't actually particularly need to figure out how to refashion websites to be good for AI agents, because they're figuring it out on their own. And what I mean by that is that, like, you can actually ask an LLM, what's the best way to make my website more accessible to, to agents, to AI, and sort of go down that path pretty quickly. And several of the new protocols that are being promoted, the MCP, or agent to agent, A to A, have a lot of AI driven development behind them. Like, it's actually AI is helping to determine what the right, protocols should be here in order to allow agents to talk. Also reminds me a little bit of, we talked about that, I think it was called Gibber Talk or something like that. It reminds me of that a little bit, right? So like, this is the web version of that. It's like, how do you make this more efficient for AIs to talk with one another when they run into each other in the wild, in this case on the web? It's happening. It's here. Good news again for us humans is we won't have to worry about it too much, because it's not for us, and the AIs are going to figure out how to talk to each other just fine.
I'll throw in an anecdotal example that illustrates this sort of in action, the transition. So I had a Chevy Bolt EV, got hit, it's totaled. So now I'm in the market for a new EV, and I started going to cars.com and Car Gurus and these sites, and they're just very frustrating and difficult to use, sort of, e-commerce 1.0. So I went to ChatGPT and said, here are my criteria. I want this trim level. I want this price range. I want this number of miles. I'm looking for these colors. Show me these listings. And it went boom, 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 boom. And it showed me a whole bunch of them. And then at that point, I was able to click through and look at the individual cars. But like the pain of going to all these different aggregators, Auto Trader, Edmunds, Kelley Blue Book, whatever, and kind of putting out all my criteria, that, I don't have to do that now. I can just, there's a question about whether ChatGPT is getting everything, but nonetheless, that user experience is the future. Here are my criteria. Here's what I want. Show me everything that conforms to it. And then maybe I go to the website at the very last minute to check out some details.
It's a complete leapfrog, what's happening with that. And what's interesting is part of this, and John, I think you're right when you're saying that, the LLMs will figure this out, but there's still, if you're a brand or anybody who's in business, you're going to try to do what you can to optimize for that environment. After, digging into this for the better part of the past 6 months here, one of the interesting things that isn't often talked about, but is highly effective, is if you provide a version of your website in ML.ML, Markdown language. And what it does is it makes it optimized for for language models to be able to understand what's on your website. And it's surprisingly highly effective. And you can even just go to ChatGPT and ask it, how effective is it to create a version of my website in .ml, and you'll see it's highly effective to be able to optimize for that. So interesting, because people always ask, like, what do I do to get ready for this? I found that that's a highly effective solution as opposed to SEO and how to get discovered.
There's a big discussion about your brand, because there's a kind of commoditization that happens when people are doing that. But let's leave that for another day.
Yeah, there's a flattening that's definitely happening there. All right, well, let's talk about this deal with Samsung, and Samsung's getting ready to strike a deal with Perplexity. This can have a wide-ranging impact in the world of AI and mobility. They're aiming to embed next-gen AI features across their device lineup. So that means boosting interactive and personalized experiences across Samsung smartphones, TVs, and more. Greg, what are your thoughts on this?
Well, I think it's a big deal for Perplexity. I mean, they're raising a $500 million round in theory, and Samsung's going to be an investor, but the strategic relationship is the biggest deal. They have kind of struggled to break out and get visibility and generate awareness, and this would do that very, very quickly, and potentially sets up an acquisition by Samsung. And it's a sort of a little bit of a declaration of independence between Samsung and Google. Samsung is Google's largest Android partner, and Google really relies on Samsung for distribution, and the search app is preloaded, and maps and other stuff. So I think this is potentially enormously significant for Perplexity and potentially significant for Google. We'll have to see what it looks like and how it shows up, but it's a kind of a big sea change for those guys potentially.
Yeah.
You can see how the world is going to get carved up here a little bit. This is kind of the first of these kinds of deals. Definitely, I guess Apple's deal with OpenAI was maybe the first, but I don't know.
But that's kind of inconsequential. That's not proven to be particularly significant.
I was just going to say, I don't know about you, but I don't really use that capability on my iPhone.
No, you go straight to ChatGPT. Why would you go through Siri?
Yeah. It's a terrible experience. But it is an interesting move, if for no other reason than 2 years ago, let's say, it would have been completely unimaginable for Google to get displaced in a major spot like this. And now it's happening, right? Like, so that there could possibly be this change where a different approach to search is now the default option in all Samsung phones.
It's unclear if it's going to go that far, John. I just want to be clear on that. It may not go that far, but certainly it presents an alternative to people, if nothing else.
Yeah. Well, it'd be interesting I think maybe even be more interesting if it didn't go that far, because this is sort of the Perplexity's main reason for being, right? Is as a search augment or replacement. So it's interesting. Again, if for no other reason than 2 years ago, who would have thought that anybody would be challenging Google on mobile devices, and this is at least a challenge.
Well, so if you got a challenge. Google has a challenge now with Samsung. They've got this recent announcement that happened with Apple a few weeks ago that we talked about. We've talked about that on the podcast a couple of times, but their market share is definitely at risk in these mobile environments here, and that's obviously where everybody is. That's where all the eyeballs are. So interesting days for Google, without a doubt.
Yeah, I mean it's really interesting for Samsung, because I think they have struggled being sort of in Google's shadow. They have not had really their own distinct identity as a smartphone. I mean, they do, and they're very popular, and it's a big brand, but it's always been sort of, they've been joined at the hip with Google, and this gives them an opportunity to really kind of break out and do something different, that's different than the Pixel or different than the other Android OEMs. This is a unique relationship for them.
Yeah. So it's good, and it'll be interesting to see how Samsung brands this and how it ties in with their current personalization branding and what that's all going to mean.
This could really be a prelude to an acquisition by Samsung. I mean, Samsung has made a couple of different acquisitions to boost Bixby. At least part of the founding team behind Siri created another version of that was supposed to be sort of a next gen version, and that got bought by Samsung and folded into Bixby. But Bixby's kind of an also ran as a voice assistant, and this might give them the sort of much more power, plus all the agentic stuff that Perplexity is doing could really add some pizzazz to Samsung, as use these Samsung agents to help you shop, to help you plan, to help you do this and that and the other. It's pretty interesting to contemplate.
Very cool. Let's wrap it up here. This has been an interesting moment in all of these different topics that we discussed today, and we'll see what happens with this agentic web and how that impacts websites. I wouldn't doubt it if in the next 3 to 6 months are going to be significant advancements in terms of how large language models like Claude, ChatGPT, Perplexity, and others become this hub for workflow, right? And we've talked about MCP. MCP is modeled context protocol, is what it stands for. And the idea is that it creates interoperability so that the large language model can access all these different areas. So it'll be, this is the future of where this is going with Agentic Web. Any last thoughts, you guys, before we wrap up?
It's amazing. I'm going to go read my newspaper about me.
Yeah. It's ironic that they call it a newspaper, given what's
Right. That is funny. Throwbacky. Like in a Telegraph or something.
retro chic, retro cool. I feel like overwhelmed by all these developments that are happening all the time. There's just so much to pay attention to, so much to be aware of. It's really an exciting time. The stuff you demonstrated today is really interesting. There's also some major league privacy stuff that comes out of that, right? Yeah. But I think it's just super interesting, and I'm just hanging on by the skin of my teeth, or whatever the expression is. I feel like it's just all moving really, really fast.
Yeah, it sure is. It's exciting. It's exciting.
All right. Good stuff, guys. Well, thanks so much. And thanks everybody for listening, and we will see you next week.
All right. Thanks, everybody.
Bye-bye.